I've been married to Charlotte for 10 years. We have two kids, Liam, 8, and Abby, 5, who light up my world every day. I work as a foreman at a construction site, long hours that keep me away from home more than I'd like. Charlotte's a doctor, respected, admired, the kind of woman people stop to praise at grocery stores or community events. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Or so I thought. Lately, something shifted. Her shifts at the hospital started stretching longer. First one late night a week, then two, then four. I'd come home to find the kids already asleep, the house quiet, and Charlotte either gone or sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, lost in her own world. When I'd ask about work, she'd barely look up. Busy. You know how it is. I try not to think too much of it. People in her line of work always get pulled into emergencies, right? I told myself she was just tired. But then the whispers started. It was a buddy of mine who said it first, offhand, like it was nothing. You hear anything about Charlotte spending a lot of time with that intern? Kyle, I think his name is. I laughed it off. That's what you do when someone says something that doesn't fit the story you've been telling yourself. Charlotte wouldn't do that. She couldn't. But once the seed of doubt is planted, it grows. I started noticing things I'd missed before. The way she'd check her phone and smile at a message before locking the screen, or how she'd leave the house looking a little too put together for a night shift. Then one evening, as she grabbed her coat and keys, I finally asked, "Are you sure you're working late tonight?" She froze, just for a second. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" Her smile looked wrong. And for the first time in our marriage, I didn't believe her. It was the little things that started eating away at me. Charlotte's phone used to be something she'd forget about, left on the counter or buried in her bag, like it didn't matter. Now it was always in her hand or close by. If I walked into the room, she'd lock the screen or turn it face down. At first, I didn't think much of it. Doctors are always on call, right? Emergencies happen. But there were moments I couldn't shake, like the night I walked into the living room to say goodnight. She was curled up under a blanket, phone glowing in her hand. She smiled at whatever was on the screen, this soft, secretive kind of smile. A smile I hadn't seen in a long time. When she noticed me, the smile disappeared. "Just work stuff," she said, tucking the phone beside her. I didn't push it, but something about the way she looked at me, a little startled, a little guilty, sat heavy in my chest. The next morning, while the kids were getting ready for school, she rushed out of the house earlier than usual. "Early shift," she called out, her coat already over her arm. Abby tugged on my shirt as Charlotte's car pulled out of the driveway. "Mommy forgot her lunch," she said, holding up the brown bag Charlotte always packed for herself. I took it from her, staring at it. I didn't know what bothered me more, that she'd left in such a hurry she forgot it, or that I hadn't even noticed she was gone. The lunch bag sat on the counter all day, a quiet reminder that Charlotte's early shift hadn't been so urgent she'd remembered to grab it. I didn't bring it up when I saw her that evening. I told myself it didn't matter. But the doubt was still there, gnawing away at me. A week later, I stopped at a gas station after work, just for a drink. It was one of those places I'd been going to for years, the kind where you know everyone. Sam, the cashier, was behind the counter, and he gave me this look when I walked in. The kind of look that makes your gut tighten. "How's Charlotte doing?" he asked casually. Too casually. I shrugged. "Busy. Same as always." Sam nodded slowly, like he was mulling something over. Then he said it, soft enough to sound like nothing, but loud enough to bury itself in my head. "Heard she's been spending a lot of time with that new intern at the hospital." Kyle, I think? Just something people are saying. I stared at him, my hands suddenly cold despite the heat of the day. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sam held up his hands like he didn't want trouble. "Nothing, man. I'm just saying. People talk." I didn't say another word. I paid for my drink and left, but his voice followed me all the way to the truck. People talk. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Charlotte had always been surrounded by interns. She was their mentor, their guide. That was her job. But now there was a name to go with the whispers. Kyle. I drove home, feeling something in my chest that I couldn't explain. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was worse. It was doubt, the kind that lingers even when you try to push it away. And the worst part? I couldn't stop hearing Sam's voice. People talk. I tried to let it go. I really did. But once you hear something like that, something you don't want to believe. It follows you everywhere. At work, I'd be knee-deep in rebar and blueprints, but my mind would wander. I'd think of Charlotte's phone, her late nights, the look she gave her screen when she thought I wasn't watching. By the time I got home, I'd feel like a ghost in my own life. It wasn't just the whispers that got to me. It was the patterns, little things I hadn't paid attention to before, like how she started dressing for her shifts. Charlotte had always been professional, clean scrubs, minimal makeup. That was her style. Lately, though, she was polished. Her hairstyle just right, a hint of perfume trailing behind her. Not the one I bought her either. This one was different, lighter, sweeter. She'd come home late, sometimes past midnight, her smile tight and her explanations rehearsed. We had a trauma case come in. Took hours to stabilize the patient. Or one of the residents needed me to oversee a procedure. Always believable. Always just enough to keep me quiet. But then I started to notice her car. Charlotte drove a silver SUV. It wasn't new, but it was reliable. She was meticulous about keeping it clean, too. Every Friday, she'd take it through the car wash, vacuum out the inside, and wipe down the dash. I never thought much of it. But now I noticed how spotless it always was. Not a single crumb, no stray toys from Liam or Abby, no half-empty coffee cups. Just clean. Too clean. It bothered me. One Saturday, she said she was covering a shift at the hospital. She packed up early, kissed Abby on the head, and called out, "See you later," as she walked out the door. Abby turned to me after she left. "Why doesn't Mommy take us to work anymore?" The question stopped me cold. "She's busy, sweetie," I said, ruffling her hair. "Maybe next time." But my daughter was right. Charlotte used to love bringing the kids to the hospital on quiet weekends, showing them the break room, introducing them to nurses who cooed over how big Liam was getting or how cute Abby's curls were. It made her happy, us happy. Now, it hadn't happened in months. I sat with that thought for the rest of the day. That night, as Charlotte came in the door, I was still awake. She looked surprised to see me sitting at the kitchen table, a beer in my hand. "Long day?" I asked. She blinked like she wasn't ready for the question. "Yeah, long day." She didn't offer more, didn't sit with me, or even drop her bag. She just kissed me on the cheek, so quick it didn't feel real, and headed upstairs. I waited until I heard the shower turn on, then glanced out the window into the driveway. Her SUV sat there, spotless as ever, the headlights still ticking softly as they cooled. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel until then. Suspicion. Real, undeniable suspicion. Suspicion is a slow burn. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds quietly, until it's all you can think about. I spent the rest of that night tossing in bed, staring at the ceiling while Charlotte slept beside me, perfectly still. I couldn't let it go anymore. I needed to know. The next morning, Charlotte was out early again. "Another shift," she'd said, brushing me off with a quick kiss before heading out the door. The kids were at my sister's for the weekend, so I was alone in the house. Just me, my thoughts, and the question that wouldn't leave me alone. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, until finally I stood up and grabbed my jacket. I told myself I just needed to clear my head, but I knew exactly what I was about to do. Charlotte's car sat in the driveway, as clean as ever. I approached it, my keys heavy in my hand. My heart was pounding, hard and steady, as I opened the driver's side door. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't hers, not the faint scent of sanitizer or the perfume I used to know. This was something different, subtle, a hint of cologne, maybe mixed with something sweet, like gum or cheap air freshener. I sat in the driver's seat and took a deep breath. For a moment, I just stared at the dash, the spotless cup holders, the perfectly clean passenger seat. It was too clean. It looked like no one had sat there at all, except when I reached under the seat. My fingers brushed something crumpled and soft. I pulled it out and stared at it. It was a receipt from a coffee shop, a place across town I knew well, the kind of place you stop at when you're meeting someone, not grabbing something on the way to work. The date was from 2 days ago. 2 drinks, both fancy enough that I knew they weren't for her alone. The name written on the top made my stomach drop. Kyle. I sat there for a long time, the slip of paper burning in my hand. I didn't want it to mean what I knew it meant. I told myself 1,000 things to explain it away. Maybe it was work-related. Maybe she was mentoring him, helping him with something outside the hospital. Charlotte was a doctor. People looked up to her. It was nothing. Except deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. I tucked the receipt back under the seat, right where I found it. I didn't want her to know I'd seen it. Not yet. That evening, when she came home, I watched her differently. The way she didn't quite meet my eyes when she said hello. The way she set her phone face down on the counter while she poured herself a glass of wine. I noticed everything now. She sat on the couch later that night, curled up under a blanket, texting with a faint smile on her face. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I wanted to ask her, "Who's Kyle?" I wanted to tell her I'd found the receipt, that I wasn't stupid, that I could feel something slipping between us. But I didn't say a word. Instead, I sat in the chair across from her, pretending to watch the TV while my mind spun. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Once you see something, you can't unsee it. That receipt, Kyle's name, 2 coffees, it played over and over in my head like a broken record. I wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to my imagination running wild. But the truth was right in front of me. It wasn't just the paper. It was her behavior. It was everything. The distance. The late nights. The phone. The cracks weren't cracks anymore. They were gaping holes. That Monday, I stayed home from work. I told the guys on site I wasn't feeling well. Figured they'd assume I had the flu or something. The truth was I couldn't focus. All I could think about was Charlotte, and where she really was when she said she was working. She'd left early again, the usual, "I'll probably be late tonight," ringing in my ears. I waited until her car disappeared down the street, then I grabbed my phone. Months ago, we'd set up a family tracking app. It was her idea, a way to keep tabs on the kids and each other for emergencies. I'd never used it for anything else. Until now. I opened the app and stared at the little dot. It should have been at the hospital. Instead, it was moving across town, heading toward an area I knew well. Near a hotel. My stomach sank. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the kind of hit that knocks the wind out of you and leaves you reeling. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys, but I didn't stop myself. I had to know. The drive felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. When I pulled into the hotel parking lot, I didn't get out of the truck right away. I sat there with the engine running, staring through the windshield at the front entrance. Her car was there, parked neatly in the lot, like it belonged. I turned the engine off and sat in the silence. I don't know what I expected to feel. Anger, maybe rage. But all I felt was emptiness. A heavy, crushing weight that settled deep in my chest. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to see it with my own eyes to know what was happening. Charlotte wasn't at work. She hadn't been at work for a long time. When I got back home, I felt like I was on autopilot. I went through the motions, drinking a glass of water, pacing the living room, staring at the clock. I kept telling myself I needed to wait, to think, to plan before I said anything. But my patience was gone. When Charlotte finally walked through the door that night, her coat slung over her arm and her heels clicking softly against the tile, I couldn't look at her. I was sitting at the table, the empty glass in front of me. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "Everything okay?" I stared at the table, my hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. "How was work?" I asked, my voice calm. Too calm. "Busy," she said, like always. "We had a trauma come in late. Took hours." I looked up then, meeting her eyes. For a second, I thought I saw it. A flicker of something like guilt, like she knew I didn't believe her. But it passed, and she turned away, setting her bag down on the counter. That was the moment I knew for sure. The woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd built a life with, was lying to me. I followed her. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who did something like that, but when suspicion takes hold, it doesn't let go. It wasn't anger driving me. It wasn't even jealousy. It was the need to stop feeling like I was losing my mind. That morning, Charlotte left the house early again, dressed and polished like always. She told me she'd be late. I nodded like I believed her, like it didn't matter. I waited 5 minutes before opening the app. Her dot moved across town, past the hospital, to where I already knew she was going. The hotel. I kept my distance as I drove, far enough back that she wouldn't notice. Watching her car pull into the same parking lot made something in my chest go cold. She sat there for a moment, looking at her phone, before getting out and disappearing through the hotel's entrance. I didn't follow her inside. I didn't need to. Seeing it was enough. I sat in my truck across the street, the engine off, the quiet around me deafening. I don't know how long I stayed there, minutes, maybe hours, staring at the building like it might give me answers. It didn't. On the way home, I felt like a man driving on autopilot. The house was empty when I got there, cold and quiet. I sat at the kitchen table for the rest of the afternoon, the minutes crawling by as the same thought circled in my mind. Charlotte was lying to me, and now I couldn't deny it anymore. I didn't tell her I knew. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I started noticing details I'd missed before, things that had been right in front of me. Her scrubs, once wrinkled from long shifts, were always crisp now, almost like she hadn't been at work at all. The smell of her was different too. Not the sterile scent of the hospital, but something lighter, sweeter, unfamiliar. On the evenings she worked late. She'd come home showered, her hair still damp, carrying the same practiced smile she always had. "Long night," she'd say, dropping her bag by the door. I nod like I believed her. The kids didn't notice the difference. Liam still ran to her every time she walked through the door, and Abby would cling to her leg, babbling about whatever game she'd played that day. Charlotte smiled for them the way she used to smile for me. And for a moment, it almost felt normal. But it wasn't normal. Nothing was anymore. I didn't sleep much those nights. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, breathing evenly, like she didn't have a secret buried under our roof. I'd listen to the house settle, the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the floors, and wonder how long it had been going on. Weeks? Months? I thought about asking her. I thought about walking into the kitchen one morning and laying everything out. I know. I've seen the hotel. I've seen you. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed more than my gut, more than a parking lot and a name on a receipt. The truth was heavy now, like a weight pressing down on me every second of the day. I carried it quietly, but I carried it everywhere. The days started to blur together. Charlotte's routine stayed the same. The late shifts, the quick goodbyes, the phone always turned face down. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, for a clear sign I couldn't ignore. But the truth was I was afraid to face it. Then, something happened I wasn't ready for. It was a Friday evening. I'd come home earlier than usual, hoping to spend some time with the kids before dinner. Liam was on the living room floor, building a fort out of couch cushions, and Abby was humming to herself, coloring at the table. Charlotte was supposed to be working late, so when her phone buzzed on the counter, left behind by accident, I froze. The screen lit up, a name I didn't recognize. Kyle. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I told myself not to touch it, to let it go, but I couldn't. My hand moved on its own. I picked up the phone, swiped, and saw the message. "Missed you today. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same time." I stared at the words until they blurred. My hand shook. My chest felt tight, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. I scrolled up, my thumb moving through a string of messages that confirmed everything I'd been afraid of. The late nights weren't late shifts. The phone calls weren't work emergencies. Kyle wasn't just some intern. It wasn't innocent. "Daddy, look what I drew." Abby's voice pulled me back. I blinked, quickly locking the phone and setting it back on the counter. My daughter held up a picture of a rainbow, smiling proudly. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. The smile she gave me broke me a little. I wanted to hold on to that moment, pretend everything was fine, just for her. But it wasn't. Nothing was fine. Charlotte came home late that night, just like always. I sat at the table, pretending to read the paper while she walked in, her keys jingling softly. "Long night?" I asked, not looking up. "Yeah," she said, brushing past me. "I'm exhausted." She didn't notice her phone was right where she left it. She didn't know I'd seen the messages. But I did. And now everything was about to change. I pulled into the hotel parking lot and spotted her car right away, tucked near the back, like she didn't want it to be seen. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped out of the truck and headed inside. The lobby felt too bright, too calm. Everything about the place was clean and polished, like it wasn't hiding the ugliest truth I'd ever known. I walked past the front desk without a word, my boots heavy against the tile. And then I saw her. Charlotte. She sat in a corner booth of the lounge, laughing softly, her hand brushing the arm of the man sitting across from her. He looked young, his suit sharp, his hair styled just so. Kyle, the intern. I froze, the sight of them slamming into me like a brick wall. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The woman I'd spent 10 years building a life with, the mother of my kids, was here, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. Like none of this mattered. Something inside me broke. I don't remember moving toward them, but suddenly I was there, standing at the edge of their table, my presence impossible to ignore. Charlotte's face drained of color the moment she looked up. Her smile vanished. People turned their heads. I didn't care. It happened fast. Chairs scraped against the floor. Voices murmured. Someone called for security. I don't know what I said, what words spilled out of me as the anger boiled over, but I know I didn't hold back. The man shrank in his seat, pale and wide-eyed, while Charlotte sat there frozen, her face a mixture of shock and shame. I left before they could throw me out. The hotel doors slid open, and the cold air hit me like a slap. My hands were trembling as I climbed into my truck, the adrenaline still rushing through me, but I didn't stop to calm down. I drove straight home. The house felt different when I stepped inside. Emptier, quieter, as though the walls themselves knew what had just happened. I didn't hesitate. I went straight to our bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Her things went into it, clothes, shoes, the perfume she always wore. I yanked dresses off hangers, grabbed her makeup bag off the dresser, and stuffed it all inside. Every piece of her I could find. Her life in this house was packed away. When I zipped the suitcase shut, I set it by the front door and sat down at the kitchen table. The silence was deafening. I stared at the bag, waiting for her to walk in, waiting for the explosion that was coming. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't shaking. I was done. The suitcase sat by the door, a silent statement waiting to be heard. I sat in the kitchen, staring at it, replaying the scene from the hotel in my head. Her laughter, her hand on his arm, the way she froze when she looked up and saw me standing there. The moment her world collided with mine, everything breaking apart. I didn't know how long I waited. The house was still, too still. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than the last, like it was counting down to something inevitable. When Charlotte finally came home, her car pulling into the driveway, I stayed seated. I heard her footsteps in the hall, pausing when she saw the suitcase. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Then the sound of her moving closer, her bag dropping to the floor, her keys clattering on the table. I didn't look up when she entered the kitchen. I felt her standing there, just a few feet away, the weight of her presence heavier than it had ever been. I knew she was staring at me, trying to gauge the situation, trying to figure out what to say. But there was nothing left to say. The suitcase was all she needed to see. After a long pause, she finally moved, footsteps back to the hallway, the soft scrape of the suitcase wheels on the floor. The door opened and closed behind her. And then silence. I stayed at the table for a while longer, staring at the empty space where the suitcase had been. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. It would never be the same. Upstairs, Liam's bedroom door was cracked open, his nightlight glowing softly through the gap. Abby's favorite stuffed animal sat forgotten on the couch. They didn't know yet. They didn't know that everything had changed. I rubbed my hands over my face and exhaled, long and slow, feeling the weight of it all settle in. The pretending was over. Charlotte was gone. The house felt different after she left. Empty, but not in the way it gets when the kids are at school or Charlotte used to work late. This was a heavier kind of quiet, final, unrelenting. I sat in the kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, half expecting her to come back, half wanting her to. But she didn't. Her things were gone, packed into the suitcase I'd set by the door. Just like that, 10 years of marriage were reduced to a bag and a closed door. At some point, I got up and moved through the house. Liam's schoolwork was still spread across the dining table, his handwriting neat and careful. Abby's stuffed bunny sat next to her tiny pink shoes in the hallway, where she'd kicked them off earlier. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, the worn fabric soft against my callous fingers. The kids. That's where my mind went. They didn't know yet. Didn't know that their mother wasn't coming home tonight. Maybe not for a long time. I didn't know how I'd tell them, or what words I'd use, but I knew I couldn't hide it. I spent the rest of the night pacing, drifting through rooms that felt too big now. I'd catch glimpses of things she'd left behind. A scarf on the coat rack, a pair of earrings on the bathroom sink, the faint scent of her perfume in the bedroom. Little reminders of what had been, of what was now broken beyond repair. When I finally lay down in bed, the space beside me felt colder than I'd imagined it could. For years, I'd been coming home late, exhausted, climbing into bed while she slept. I thought I'd gotten used to the distance. I hadn't. Lying there in the dark, I realized this was just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The next morning, the weight of it all hit me the moment I opened my eyes. The bed beside me was empty. Her scent still lingered faintly on the pillow, but Charlotte was gone, and this time it felt final. The kids were up early. Liam sat on the couch, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the TV without really watching it. Abby sat cross-legged on the floor, clutching her stuffed bunny like it might give her answers. I don't think they understood. Not yet, but they knew something was wrong. Kids always do. "Where's Mom?" Liam asked quietly as I set a plate of toast on the table. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first. I sat down across from him and cleared my throat. She's staying somewhere else for a while. She's busy with work." Even as the words came out, I knew they wouldn't be enough. Liam looked at me, too smart, too old for his years, and I could tell he didn't buy it. "Did you fight?" I hesitated. "Sometimes grown-ups need space, buddy. But it's going to be okay." He nodded slowly, like he wanted to believe me. Abby just hummed softly to herself, her face tucked against her bunny's fur. After dropping them off at school, the silence hit me like a freight train. For 10 years, I'd come home knowing Charlotte would be there eventually, that no matter what happened, the house would still feel whole. Now it felt like a shell, hollow, cold, and far too big. I busied myself cleaning up. I didn't want to sit still. Sitting meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. But as I scrubbed the counters and gathered up the remnants of her things she hadn't taken, the mug she always used, the scarf still hanging in the hall, I couldn't stop the anger that boiled just under the surface. By the afternoon, her absence started to ripple outward. My sister called, asking if everything was okay. "Charlotte hasn't answered my texts," she said. I told her things were fine, but she knew I was lying. My voice cracked in all the wrong places. Then there were the neighbors. Mrs. Thompson, who lived next door, waved as I checked the mail. "Haven't seen Charlotte around. Working hard as always." Her tone was innocent enough, but the question stung. I forced a smile, nodded, and went back inside. I knew the whispers were coming. People notice when someone disappears from a life they're supposed to be part of. They'd ask questions, and I'd have no answers. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at my phone. Charlotte hadn't called, hadn't texted. I half expected something, an apology, an excuse, but there was nothing. Liam sat across from me while we ate dinner, pushing peas around his plate. "Is Mom coming back tomorrow?" I set my fork down, the weight of the question pressing into me. "I don't know, buddy." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, his face falling as he stared at his plate. Abby, too young to really understand, whispered to her bunny like it might tell her where Mom was. After they went to bed, I sat in the living room, the quiet louder than it had ever been. I thought about all the choices Charlotte had made, about the night she lied to me, the mornings she kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong. All of it led us here, to an empty house, 2 confused kids, and a man sitting alone, trying to piece together what was left. The consequences of her betrayal weren't just mine to bear. The kids would feel it too. It wasn't fair to them, but I couldn't protect them from this. Nothing would ever be the same again. The divorce was quick. Quiet even. There wasn't much left to fight for by the time we sat across from each other in that sterile office, signing papers that ended a decade of marriage. I didn't look at her as I signed, and she didn't look at me. It was easier that way. Charlotte got the kids. It made sense, I guess. She had the stable hours, the respectable title, the life that looked perfect from the outside. I wasn't bitter about that part. Liam and Abby needed their mother. and I couldn't take them away just to satisfy my pride. I didn't want them caught in the middle. The house went with her too. I didn't fight it. I packed what I needed, my clothes, my tools, and a few pictures of the kids, and walked out the door, leaving behind the life I thought I'd built. For a while I was just drifting. The apartment I found was small and plain, the kind of place you rent when you don't know what comes next. Most nights, I sat on the couch staring at the empty walls, listening to nothing but the hum of the fridge. The silence felt heavier now, but I let it stay. It reminded me of everything I'd lost, but it also reminded me of what mattered. Liam and Abby. I saw them on weekends. We'd go to the park or sit in my tiny living room watching cartoons, their laughter filling a space that didn't feel so empty anymore. Liam was still quiet, but he smiled when I showed him how to fix things around the apartment. Abby asked about Mommy sometimes, but she never asked why I wasn't there anymore. I didn't have the answers for her yet. Maybe someday. As the months passed, the despair started to loosen its grip. Slowly, I found something else, a quiet kind of hope. I didn't know what life would look like now, but I knew I had to build something new, something better for myself and for the kids. There were moments of peace. Early mornings with coffee, watching the sun rise over the parking lot. Moments when I reminded myself that I was still here, still standing. Life hadn't ended. It had just changed. I was alone now, yes, but I wasn't finished. Liam and Abby would grow up knowing that no matter what happened between their mother and me, their father was there. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was where it all started again. I didn't know where the road led, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out.